The wind howled through the Wyoming plains, sharp as a blade, cutting through the thin jacket of 14-year-old Elias Torres. He stood shivering at the edge of a desolate road, his backpack slung over one shoulder, the weight of his parents' rejection heavier than the snow piling around his sneakers. They had left him here, miles from home, because he dared to love who he was. Elias's breath fogged in the freezing air, his dark eyes scanning the horizon for a car, a sign, anything. The memory of his mother's tear-streaked face and his father's cold silence burned worse than the cold. "You're no son of ours," his father had said, the words echoing as the truck's taillights faded into the dusk. He was 14, gay, and abandoned in the winter of 2010, left to freeze for being himself. But Elias was a fighter even then. He clutched the straps of his backpack, his only possessions, a few clothes, a worn notebook, and a photo of his older sister, Marisol, who had left for college and never looked back. His fingers, numb from the cold, traced the edges of the photo. Marisol had been the only one who understood him, who saw his heart and didn't flinch. But she was gone and he was alone. The road stretched endlessly before him, a cruel metaphor for the life he now faced. He walked, each step a defiance against the world that had cast him out. The snow stung his face, but he kept moving, driven by a spark of hope he couldn't name. Hours later, headlights pierced the darkness. A trucker, a burly man named Hank with kind eyes, pulled over. "Kid, you okay?" he asked, his voice gruff but warm. Elias, too cold to speak, nodded. Hank didn't ask questions. He just opened the passenger door and handed Elias a blanket. That small act of kindness was the first warmth Elias had felt in days. Hank drove him to a shelter in Cheyenne, a cramped building filled with the sounds of coughing and quiet despair. The woman at the front desk, Miss Clara, had a no-nonsense air but a softness in her gaze. "You got a name, kid?" she asked, handing him a cup of hot cocoa. Elias hesitated, then whispered, "Elias Torres." Miss Clara nodded, as if his name carried weight. "You're safe here," she said, and for the first time that night, Elias believed it. The shelter became his temporary home, a place where he learned to navigate survival. Other kids, some younger, some older, shared stories of rejection, abuse, and loss. Elias listened, his heart breaking for them, but also hardening with resolve. He wasn't just going to survive, he was going to rise. At night, he wrote in his notebook, pouring out his pain, his dreams, his anger. He wrote about a future where he wouldn't be defined by the cold road or his parents' betrayal. He wrote about justice. School was a battleground. The local high school, where Miss Clara enrolled him, was a mix of curious stares and whispered slurs. Elias kept his head down, focusing on his studies. He was smart, always had been, and books became his refuge. History, literature, law, they spoke to him of a world where fairness could exist, where he could fight for it. A teacher, Mr. Daniels, noticed his potential. "You've got a mind for argument, Elias," he said one day, handing back a paper with an A+. "Ever thought about law?" Elias hadn't, but the seed was planted. By 16, Elias had saved enough from odd jobs, cleaning houses, tutoring younger kids, to move into a small apartment with two other shelter kids, Jamal and Riley. Jamal, a black teenager with a quick laugh and a knack for fixing things, became his best friend. Riley, a quiet trans girl with a love for poetry, taught him about resilience in ways he hadn't imagined. They were a makeshift family, bound by shared scars and unspoken loyalty. Together, they dreamed of leaving Wyoming, of building lives where they could be free. Elias's nights were spent studying, his days working. He earned a scholarship to a community college in Denver, a city that felt like a different world from the plains. At 18, he packed his bag again, but this time it was with purpose. Denver was vibrant, alive, a place where he could blend in and stand out all at once. He majored in pre-law, his eyes set on a future where he could change things. But the past clung to him like frost. Every time he saw a family laughing in a park, or heard a parent cheer at a graduation, the ache of his own abandonment flared. In Denver, Elias met Leo Navarro, a 20-year-old art student with a crooked smile and a passion for painting. Leo was everything Elias wasn't: open, carefree, unapologetically himself. They met at a campus coffee shop, where Leo spilled his latte and Elias, ever practical, handed him a napkin. "You're my hero," Leo teased, his brown eyes sparkling. Elias blushed, and used to attention that didn't come with judgment. Their connection was instant, a spark that warmed the parts of Elias he'd thought were frozen forever. Their first date was in an autumn park, the leaves a riot of red and gold. Leo talked about color theory, his hands waving animatedly, while Elias listened, captivated by his energy. "You don't say much, but I can tell you're thinking big things," Leo said, nudging him. Elias smiled, his guard lowering. For the first time he felt seen, not as a reject or a survivor, but as Elias whole, worthy, loved. But love, Elias learned, was complicated. Leo's family was accepting, their home filled with warmth and noise, a stark contrast to the silence of Elias's past. When Leo invited him to Thanksgiving, Elias froze. "I don't do families," he said, his voice sharp. Leo didn't push, but the hurt in his eyes lingered. Elias wanted to explain, to tell Leo about the road, the cold, the betrayal, but the words stayed locked inside. As Elias neared graduation, his focus sharpened. He applied to law school, his essays raw with the truth of his life. He wrote about the shelter, about Jamal and Riley, about the kids still out there, left to freeze. He was accepted to NYU Law, a dream he hadn't dared to dream at 14. Leo celebrated with him, painting a canvas of a starry night with Elias's silhouette against it. "You're going to change the world," Leo said, his voice thick with pride. Elias wanted to believe him, but the weight of his past made him doubt he could ever be enough. New York City was a whirlwind, a place where Elias felt both invisible and exposed. At 22, he stepped into NYU Law with a hunger to prove himself. The campus was a maze of ambition, filled with students who wore privilege like a second skin. Elias, with his thrift store suits and quiet intensity, stood out. His professors noticed his sharpness, his ability to dissect cases with a clarity born of pain. But the city also reminded him of his fragility. Walking past families in Central Park, he felt the old ache, the memory of his parents' rejection like a wound that never healed. Leo followed him to New York, enrolling in an art program at Pratt. Their relationship deepened, but it wasn't easy. Elias's long hours studying left little time for Leo's spontaneity. "You're always running," Leo said one night, his voice soft but firm. They were in their tiny Brooklyn apartment, the walls covered with Leo's sketches. Elias wanted to argue, to say he was building a future for them both, but he saw the loneliness in Leo's eyes and stayed silent. Instead, he pulled Leo close, their foreheads touching, a silent promise to try harder. Law school was grueling, but Elias thrived on it. He joined the legal aid clinic representing marginalized clients, kids like him cast out for who they were. Each case felt personal, a chance to rewrite his own story. One client, a 15-year-old named Aisha, had been kicked out for being queer. Her defiance, her refusal to break, reminded Elias of himself. He fought for her, securing her a place in a foster home that accepted her. When she hugged him, tears in her eyes, Elias felt a purpose he hadn't known he needed. But the past wasn't done with him. One night, scrolling through social media, Elias saw a post from his sister, Marisol. She was a doctor now, living in Seattle, her life polished and perfect. The sight of her smiling with her own family, husband, kids, a dog, hit Elias like a punch. Why hadn't she come for him? Why hadn't she fought? He shut his laptop, his hands shaking. Leo found him staring out their window, the city lights blurring through his tears. "Talk to me," Leo whispered, but Elias couldn't. Not yet. His third year of law school brought an internship at a prestigious firm, Carter & Weiss. The firm handled high-profile cases, and Elias was assigned to a pro bono project defending LGBTQ+ youth. His supervisor, Rachel Carter, was a fierce advocate with a reputation for winning impossible cases. She saw something in Elias, a fire she recognized. "You've got a story," she said one day, her eyes piercing. "Use it." Elias nodded, but he wondered if his story was a strength or a scar. The internship led to a case that changed everything. Elias was tasked with researching a class action lawsuit against a religious organization in Wyoming that ran a conversion therapy program. The details were sickening. Teenagers subjected to psychological abuse, families torn apart. As Elias dug deeper, he found a name that stopped his heart. Reverend Paul Torres. His father, the man who had left him to freeze, was now a pastor, leading a program that broke kids like him. Elias's world tilted. He spent nights poring over documents, his anger fueling his work. The lawsuit aimed to shut down the program and hold its leaders accountable. Elias wanted to confront his father, to demand answers, but Rachel warned him about bias. "You're too close to this," she said. Elias disagreed. He was exactly the right person for it. He poured his pain into the case, building a file of evidence that was airtight. Leo noticed the change in him. "You're not sleeping," he said one morning, watching Elias hunched over his laptop. Elias snapped, "This is bigger than me." Leo flinched, and Elias immediately regretted it. They fought, their voices echoing in the small apartment. Leo wanted Elias to slow down, to heal, but Elias couldn't stop. Not when he was so close to facing the man who had destroyed him. The case gained traction, drawing media attention. Elias was careful, keeping his personal connection hidden. But the stress was eating at him. One night, after a long day at the firm, he and Leo walked through Prospect Park. The air was crisp, the leaves falling like memories. Leo stopped, taking Elias's hand. "I love you," he said, his voice breaking, "but I'm scared you're losing yourself." Elias wanted to promise he wouldn't, but the weight of the case, of his past, made the words stick in his throat. As the trial approached, Elias was offered a chance to join the legal team in Wyoming. He hesitated. Returning to the state where he'd been abandoned felt like walking into a fire. But he thought of Aisha, of the kids still suffering, and he said yes. Leo didn't argue, but his silence was heavy. "I'll be here," Leo said, kissing him softly. Elias boarded the plane, his heart a tangle of fear and resolve. Wyoming was a ghost that never left Elias. The moment he stepped off the plane in Cheyenne, the air felt colder, sharper, like it remembered him. At 27, he was no longer the boy left on the road, but the weight of that night clung to him. He checked into a small hotel, the city both foreign and painfully familiar. The trial was set to begin in a week, and Elias was part of a team tasked with dismantling his father's legacy. The courtroom was small, packed with reporters and advocates. Elias sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands steady but his heart racing. When Reverend Paul Torres took the stand, Elias forced himself to look. His father was older now, his hair graying, but his eyes held the same cold conviction. Paul spoke of saving youth, his voice calm, authoritative. Elias's stomach churned, but he took notes, his pen digging into the paper. The plaintiffs were a group of former program participants, their stories hauntingly similar to Elias's. One, a 19-year-old named Casey, described being locked in a room for days, told their identity was a sin. Elias met Casey's eyes during a recess, seeing his younger self reflected back. He vowed to win this not just for himself but for them all. At night, Elias called Leo, their conversation strained by distance. "I saw him today," Elias admitted, his voice low. Leo listened, offering quiet support, but Elias could hear the worry. "Come home soon," Leo said, and Elias promised he would. But home felt far away, a dream buried under the weight of the trial. The evidence was damning: medical records, testimonies, leaked program manuals. Elias's research had uncovered a pattern of abuse stretching back years. He presented his findings to the team, his voice steady but his hands trembling. Rachel praised his work, but she pulled him aside after a session. "You're carrying too much," she said. "Let us help." Elias nodded, but he couldn't let go. This was his fight. Midway through the trial, Elias's sister, Marisol, appeared in Cheyenne. She found him outside the courthouse, her face a mix of guilt and hope. "Elias," she said, her voice breaking. He froze, the years of silence stretching between them. She explained she hadn't known about their parents' actions until years later, that she'd been consumed by her own struggles. "I should have looked for you," she said, tears falling. Elias wanted to hate her, but he saw the same pain in her eyes that he carried. They hugged, a fragile step toward healing. The trial grew more intense. Paul's defense team argued religious freedom, painting the plaintiffs as misguided. Elias's anger flared, but he channeled it into his work. He cross-examined a program counselor, exposing contradictions in her testimony. The courtroom buzzed, and for the first time Elias felt powerful, like the boy who survived the cold was finally being heard. Leo arrived in Cheyenne unexpectedly, his presence a balm. They walked through a park one evening, the autumn leaves crunching underfoot. "I'm proud of you," Leo said, his hand warm in Elias's. For a moment, the weight lifted, and Elias felt like he could breathe. They sat on a bench, the city quiet around them, and Elias told Leo about his father, his sister, the road. Leo listened, his eyes never leaving Elias's face. "You're enough," Leo said, and Elias believed him. The trial's turning point came when Elias uncovered a financial trail linking the program to illegal fundraising. The evidence was a bombshell shifting public opinion. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, their signs demanding justice. Elias felt the tide turning, but he also felt the cost. Every night, he dreamed of the road, of the cold, of his father's voice. As the trial neared its end, Elias prepared for his closing argument. He stood in his hotel room, practicing in front of a mirror, his reflection a stranger. He wasn't just fighting for the plaintiffs, he was fighting for the 14-year-old boy he'd been, for the kids still out there, for a world where love wasn't a crime. He thought of Leo, of Marisol, of the family he'd built from nothing. He was ready. The courtroom was silent as Elias stood to deliver his closing argument. His voice, steady at first, grew stronger with each word. "This case isn't just about laws broken or funds misused," he said, his eyes sweeping the jury. "It's about lives shattered, about children told their love is wrong, about a boy left to freeze because of who he was." He paused, his gaze landing on his father. Paul looked away, his face unreadable. Elias spoke of the plaintiffs, their courage, their pain. He spoke of the evidence, the years of abuse hidden behind a facade of faith. But most of all, he spoke of hope, a world where no one would be abandoned for being themselves. The jury listened, rapt, and even Rachel, usually stoic, wiped her eyes. When Elias sat down, the room felt charged, like the air before a storm. The defense's closing was polished but hollow, leaning on rhetoric that rang false after Elias's words. The jury deliberated for 2 days, an eternity for Elias. He spent the time with Leo, who had stayed in Cheyenne. They explored the city, finding small moments of joy, a diner with greasy burgers, a quiet bookstore where Leo sketched Elias's profile. "You're my muse," Leo teased, but his eyes were serious. Elias felt the warmth of his love, a shield against the uncertainty. When the verdict came, the courtroom was packed. The jury found the organization guilty on all counts: abuse, fraud, and negligence. The program was ordered to shut down, and its leaders, including Paul, faced penalties. Elias felt a rush of relief, but also a strange emptiness. Justice was his, but it didn't erase the past. As the gavel fell, Paul looked at Elias for the first time. Their eyes met, and Elias saw something new. Regret, perhaps, or shame. But it was too late. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Elias gave a brief statement, his voice calm but firm. "This is for every kid who was told they weren't enough," he said. The crowd cheered, and Leo squeezed his hand. Marisol was there too, her presence a quiet support. For the first time, Elias felt like he wasn't alone. Back in New York, Elias returned to his life, but he was changed. The trial had made him a figure in the legal world, his name tied to a landmark case. Carter and Weiss offered him a permanent position, and he accepted, knowing he could do more. But the victory was bittersweet. He thought of his father, now facing his own consequences, and wondered if redemption was possible. He thought of Marisol, who was trying to rebuild their bond, and wondered if he could forgive. Leo was his anchor. One evening, they sat in their apartment, the city humming outside. Leo showed Elias a painting, a vibrant canvas of 2 figures under a starry sky, their hands entwined. "It's us," Leo said, his voice soft. Elias pulled him close, his heart full. For so long, he'd been running, from the cold, from his past, from himself. But with Leo, he could stop. He could be. Elias began mentoring young lawyers, sharing his story to inspire them. He worked with advocacy groups, pushing for laws to protect LGBTQ+ youth. Each step felt like a reclamation, a way to honor the boy he'd been. He and Marisol grew closer, their conversations raw but healing. She told him about her own guilt, her own journey, and Elias realized forgiveness wasn't about erasing pain. It was about choosing to move forward. One night, Elias received a letter. It was from his father, written from a detention center. The words were halting, filled with apologies Elias hadn't expected. Paul wrote of his shame, of the beliefs he'd clung to, of the son he'd failed. Elias read it, his hands shaking, and then set it aside. He wasn't ready to respond, but the letter was a crack in the wall between them, a possibility he hadn't imagined. Elias stood in the autumn park, the same one where he and Leo had shared their first date. It was years later, and he was 29 now, his life a tapestry of scars and triumphs. Leo stood beside him, his hand warm in Elias's, their breaths visible in the crisp air. The leaves were falling again, a cycle that felt both eternal and new. Elias had come far from the boy on the road, but the journey wasn't over. He thought of the kids he'd helped, the laws he'd influenced, the lives he'd touched. His work at Carter and Weiss was thriving, his reputation built on cases that mattered. He and Leo were planning a future, maybe a house, maybe a dog, maybe a life that felt like home. Marisol was part of that life now, her family a bridge to a past Elias was learning to reclaim. The letter from his father still sat on his desk, unanswered. Elias had read it countless times, each word a weight. Forgiveness was a choice, not a feeling, and he was still deciding. But he knew one thing. He wouldn't let his father's mistakes define him. He was more than the cold, more than the rejection. He was Elias Torres, lawyer, advocate, survivor, lover. One evening, Elias and Leo attended a gala for an LGBTQ+ youth charity. Elias was a speaker, his story now a beacon for others. As he took the stage, he saw Leo in the crowd, his smile bright. Elias spoke of the road, of the shelter, of the trial. He spoke of love, not just romantic, but the love of found family, of community, of self. "We are enough," he said, his voice ringing clear. The room erupted in applause, and Elias felt a peace he'd never known. Later, as they danced under the gala's soft lights, Leo whispered, "You're my hero." Elias laughed, the sound free and light. "You're mine," he said, and meant it. The music swirled around them, a moment of joy that felt like a promise. They had fought for this, and they had won. Elias's story didn't end with the trial or the letter or the gala. It continued in the quiet moments. Leo's laughter, Marisol's calls, the kids he mentored. It continued in the laws he helped pass, the hearts he helped heal. The boy who was left to freeze had returned, not just as a lawyer, but as a man who judged his own fate and chose love, justice, and hope. As they left the gala, Elias looked at the stars, the same ones that had watched him on that Wyoming road. They were brighter now, or maybe he was just seeing them differently. He squeezed Leo's hand, and they walked into the night, together, whole and free.